Alrighty, so we're going to go ahead and get things started. Welcome everyone, and thank you for attending today's webinar. My name is Taylor Porter. I'm the Medical Device Security Analyst with Health ISAC, and I'll be introducing today's speakers from Medcrypt. Our presenters for today's events are Axel Wirth. As a Chief Security Strategist, Axel Wirth provides strategic vision and industry leadership to Medcrypt and its customers. In his role, he helps guide the company in critical security strategy decisions and supports the adoption of leading security technologies by the healthcare industry. He's an advocate for compliance, privacy, and security, and ultimately patient safety in healthcare. Wirth draws from over 30 years of international experience in the industry. We also have Christian Rosenzweig. Christian worked for more than 10 years in software development for medical devices. There, as a project manager and software developer, he was responsible for the support and operational implementation of tasks in the product lifecycle, for the creation of documentation and training materials for end users, and for the implementation and support of conformity assessment procedures in the EU. Dealing with regulatory requirements on a daily basis ultimately led him to quality management at a large corporation where he was able to gain international experience as a quality management officer under ISO 13485. He has been supporting the consulting team at the Johner Institute since 2019. And just to give you guys a little bit of a high-level overview of this webinar, Mastering EU and FDA Cybersecurity Requirements for Medical Devices, we will look at the current threat landscape for healthcare and life sciences, common threat vectors, identify key similarities and differences in the current cybersecurity guidance for medical devices from the EU and US FDA, apply practical strategies for aligning pre- and post-market cyber processes to meet requirements for both regulatory bodies, and gain insights into specific cybersecurity topics relevant to both regulatory and expectations. And then before I let the speakers take it over, I'd like to inform everyone today that the webinar is recorded and will be made available should you wish to revisit today's contents. And please feel free to post questions in the available Q&A section so that we may address them at the end of today's presentation. We'll have some time left over to be able to do that. So with that, I'll pass it over to our speakers from Medcrypt.
Yeah, thank you, Taylor, for the introduction, and welcome everybody. Thanks for taking the time to join us here. You see the agenda up on the screen. The first section, we're going to briefly talk through some of the US versus EU difference in the approach to cybersecurity. This is largely a recap of a webinar we did back in November, but we wanted to highlight the key points, and then we're going to get into new content, specifically talk about the pre-market and post-market topics, and then in the end have time for discussion. So again, recap of some of the highlights from our previous November webinar in the beginning here.
Yeah, so I will start to talk about the similarities and differences between Europe and US. In Europe, the medical device regulation and in vitro diagnostic regulation have a clear requirement for cybersecurity. Annex 1 says if the device contains software or is software, then principles of information security in accordance with the state of the art shall be followed. This means for the manufacturer that he has to find out what is state of the art. And the MDCG guidance document 2019-16 helps in figuring out what expectations there are, but I would say just on a higher abstraction level. A little more specific is the upcoming harmonized standard in the European Union, which is the IEC 81001-5-1. This standard is also a recognized consensus standard in the USA, and we will talk about that later on. For all medical devices except the non-critical class 1 devices, a notified body has to be involved in the conformity assessment, and they do a review on the cybersecurity file, which is part of the technical documentation, and in some specific assessment types, they also test the device physically. They also do audits on the quality management system, looking for procedures related to cybersecurity. And in some seldom cases, for example, in unannounced audits, we experienced that they even take samples of the device for penetration tests.
Thanks, Christian. And to contrast that with the FDA, the difference being that the FDA is both the regulator through the pre and post market guidance, as well as the market approver. So FDA approves devices for the US market um, based on established guidances and based on the authority the FDA has under the section 524B of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act. A difference relative to Europe is that FDA approves per submitted evidence, meaning your quality system documentation, including cybersecurity documentation, and FDA may audit manufacturers for compliance and may audit their quality system, including audits for cybersecurity. But unlike the notified bodies in the EU, FDA does not inspect typically physical devices. They rely on reports provided by the manufacturer. So that's a significant differentiator, I think, in the approach to market approval.
Yeah, and if you talk about similarities between both markets, then both markets have a fairly broad definition of applicability. You could even say if software is involved in the device, then cybersecurity efforts are applicable. By this, both markets have a similar concept of cyber device. They also have a similar concept of state of the art. Both require a total product lifecycle process for security and also security risk management. Both require compliance documentation with comprehensive traceability through the security development lifecycle. And both require a penetration test for the final product by an independent entity. And not only once during development, they also both require recurring pen tests, for example, once a year. Both require post-market management and product maintenance, although they have different names for the corresponding plans. So the Europeans talk about post-market surveillance, and the FDA term is cybersecurity management plan. There is also something that is unique for Europe. For example, the 81001-5-1 will be the harmonized standard, and by that, it is kind of mandatory, not really legally binding, but it's kind of mandatory because notified body will insist on this standard. And this standard also puts its focus on devices in the market not developed under security by design principles, which are sometimes called legacy devices, or as the standard calls them, software in transition. And this is explained in detail in Annex F. This is something that I did not find so far at FDA. And there are no levels of concerns for security risks. And there is a requirement for an inventory list of third-party components within the software, but not as specific as the FDA with its SBOM requirements.
Contrasting that with how the FDA looks at it, and there are some unique aspects within the FDA. So as I mentioned earlier, FDA as of last year has the legal and statutory authority for cybersecurity. So it is now, from a legal framework perspective, more than just an extension of the quality system in the context of patient safety. It is really a mandate that the FDA has on cybersecurity. FDA also has emphasized very specific aspects of the overall security activities by a manufacturer, including a strong emphasis on threat modeling, SBOM, security controls, and especially the traceability through testing, right? So not only identify a risk or vulnerability, implement the control, but also demonstrate through testing and document that the control works as intended. FDA also has made the point that threat modeling and architectural views such as multi-patient harm views, security views, update and patch view need to be consistent with the threat model. Also, FDA is specifically asking for certain metrics as part of post-market vulnerability management. So they suggest things like, for example, defect density or the time it takes to provide a patch for a newly discovered vulnerability and so forth. And they expect manufacturers to track those key metrics. And there was early last year a draft update proposal for the pre-market guidance that has not yet been finalized, but we expect that actually this year, based on what FDA has stated. And in that draft, they were talking about the need for update of devices that have previously been cleared for the market, so that if there are updates to devices that don't have security documentation because of their legacy status, that may now be required for a renewal market approval. But again, that was just in the draft. We have not seen the final document from FDA, so we need to wait for that before we can make decisions there. This just came out a few days ago, highlighting the seriousness of the topic. And I mean, I've been dealing with the problem of medical device cybersecurity for 15 years now. And yes, it was recognized as an important topic, but I think what we have seen recently is really a significant change in attitude and in recognizing the seriousness of the topic, as in 22% of healthcare organizations now reporting that they have experienced a cyber attack on their medical devices. 75% reporting that has affected patient care, either requiring transfer of patients or requiring fallback to manual processes. Diagnosis as a significant security concern. They have increased their security budgets for OT security, including medical devices. SBOM is considered essential and important as part of the procurement decision on which device to buy. And most interestingly, they're willing to pay a higher price for more secure devices. And I think the rationale here is looking at the total cost of security. But if I buy an insecure device, I will incur cost because I need to spend additional efforts to secure the device externally and via the network. And I may incur an additional cost due to business losses should the device get compromised. And clearly it's recognized that paying more for a secure device in the long run saves money for the hospital. And therefore, again, the statement here that almost 80% are willing to pay a higher price for better secure devices. And almost 50% have reported that they have declined certain devices because of cybersecurity concerns. So again, this report just came out a couple of days ago, but I think it highlights really a change in how customers, hospitals look at cybersecurity of medical devices. This is a summary of our previous webinar, basically saying that it's not only the customers that look for more secure devices, it is also FDA and other regulators enforcing cybersecurity by, for example, rejecting devices for cybersecurity reasons, right? And there are a couple of examples listed here: failures in risk assessment, threat modeling is missing, or it is inconsistent with other security documentation that was provided. Strong emphasis on SBOM and the need to list all commercial and open source software that is in the product, including then the vulnerabilities identified in those software components. Design issues, right? How does the device actually detect, monitor, and log security events? Testing, make sure that the testing is adequately described and the testing provides traceability to the implemented security controls to demonstrate that they're actually working. Security labeling, right? Missing description of interfaces, protocols, instructions for users, and so forth. And then post-market management, as mentioned earlier, a post-market management plan, although called by a different name, is required for both EU as well as US market approval. And then, of course, that includes a way on how you intend as a manufacturer to update your software and firmware and maintain the security posture. And again, we went in our previous webinar in much more detail through those examples. Christian, do you want to take it from here?
Yeah, the total product life cycle is quite similar between US and Europe. FDA requires a total product life cycle for security, which is, for example, described in the Joint Security Plan, which you see on the left side. It shows the typical development phases from planning over requirements, architecture, implementation, testing, release to the post-market phase. And a similar approach has the IEC 81001-5-1 on the right side, with its process framework that it was copied from the IEC 62304, the software lifecycle management standard. As the 81001-5-1 is the recognized consensus standard in the US, this is the big similarity between both markets. So I highly recommend to use the 81001-5-1 for both markets as a basic instrument, and then later on add additional activities coming, for example, from the FDA guidance. Important activities that you should cover within this secure development lifecycle is security planning, security risk management based on threat modeling and on SBOM for third-party component vulnerabilities, security requirements engineering, security architectural design, security testing, including pen tests, security release, and security post-market activities like vulnerability and incident management. Yeah, next slide, please. All markets have some regulatory challenges. So we observed that the regulatory expectations are growing. FDA and also notified bodies in Europe do not slow down. In contrary, we see more and more critical questions and findings in audits at our customers. For the manufacturers, the challenge is to streamline their activities to be competitive, and thus they have to look for effective processes for cybersecurity, considering all market requirements. Many new vertical and horizontal laws in all markets that have to be considered, and that sometimes are even overlapping or contradicting each other. For example, in Europe, we have the medical device regulation, the AI Act, the Cyber Resilience Act, the Radio Equipment Directive, data protection laws, and many more. So all of them talk about cybersecurity, and you have to make your mind or have to develop processes that cover all those requirements. Next slide, please. So now we go a little bit deeper into the comparison between FDA and Europe with a very specific example of the differences and similarities of both markets. And here we see the requirement from the FDA pre-market guidance document. Just two examples. For example, the FDA pre-market guidance says, do not use passwords that are hard-coded. So that is one very specific requirement. Or another one, do not rely on cyclic redundancy checks. So such very specific requirements are spread over the overall guidance document. And in contrary to that, the IEC 81001-5-1 stays on a higher abstract level. It says, secure coding standards. The manufacturer shall establish and maintain secure coding standards consistent with current best practices related to the design and implementation of secure software systems. So it's a very generic requirement, and you have again the job or the task to identify what does it mean, current best practices. Next slide, please. But the standard shows that there's a kind of life cycle of secure coding. It first says you have to establish and maintain secure coding. Then it says the manufacturer shall establish and implement activities following secure coding standards. And the next step is then to review whether you implemented secure coding standards. So it's a kind of quality management paradigm that is implemented here. plan, do, check, act. So first you define the secure coding standards, then you implement them, and you finally check or verify whether they are really implemented. And if we look into the section 5.5.1, secure coding standards, then it says secure coding standards are described in Annex A4 of the standard. And if we go into that annex, next slide, please, then we see that it says the secure coding best practices should include at minimum. And at minimum means, again, you have to refer to the state of the art, but this list here is a little help to not forget the most important things. And it talks about, for example, avoidance of potentially exploitable implementation constructs, avoidance of banned functions, the so-called insecure functions, automated tool use, general secure coding best practices, for example, and then it mentions some standards that you can use for secure coding. So there is a little bit more of information about secure coding, but not to the full extent. But it helps a little bit in finding out what they mean by secure coding best practices. Okay, next slide. There's another term that confused me first. Beside the secure coding, it talks about secure design patterns. And this is something that is mentioned in section 4.3, software architectural design. They first talk about defense in depth architecture and then secure design practices. And again, some design best practices are mentioned. And the number E says using secure design patterns is kind of mandatory. So again, what does it mean? Secure design patterns. It's not defined in the standard. You have to find out what that means. And this is a really technological based consideration. So you have to check in the state of the art, in the technology context, what does secure design pattern mean for your specific device and your specific technology. Next slide, please. So the two terms, secure coding and secure design patterns, are not the same. Secure design patterns focuses on specifically on design level solutions, whereas secure coding focus on implementation specific security mechanisms. So I would say secure design patterns is more related to the architects of the software, and secure coding is more related to the implementers, to the developers, to the programmers of the code. Okay. So my conclusion, use a project-specific security plan to describe required secure coding and secure design patterns with detailed specification. And that is very important because we saw later on you have to verify whether those secure coding and secure design pattern requirements were really implemented. And so you need a specific requirement for that. Can you? Yeah.
Yeah, sorry
And
about that.
no problem. For both, use adequate best practices according to the state of the art. And if you want to see what state of the art is, you can go back to the FDA guidance document because we saw they already mentioned some very specific requirements. So you just can take over those requirements, not only for the US market, but also for the European market, because it seems to be state-of-the-art requirement regarding secure coding or secure design patterns. For secure coding standards, you can also make use of different publications. I found one by the Carnegie Mellon University about secure coding standards and another one for secure design patterns. So this is just an example where you can find such explanations about standards. And prior product release, verify the appropriate implementation of both, and you need a review documentation for that. So that's mandatory to have that in your security file to demonstrate that you not only required those coding standards or best practices, but you really implemented them. And to be sure that the implementation of secure coding really works, you have to qualify your software developers, so they should have a training on secure coding. And this is something the Johner Institut offers, for example. Okay.
Okay, thank you, Christian. And diving into a couple of specific topics here. Specifically post-market, what does your overall post-market management plan look like? What should it cover? And obviously, the basic concept is that you need to have a post-market risk management plan in place. You collect cybersecurity signals from various sources, including your supply chain, right? You have an SBOM, you monitor software components for vulnerabilities, you listen to your suppliers and look for notifications. You may sample and test and all those types of activities. Already touched on that earlier. You will conduct post-market testing, periodic testing and scanning for vulnerabilities and anomalies. Again, product sampling may be a good idea here. So not just the product code itself, but also then the finished product as it comes out of your manufacturing environment, because unfortunately there can also be things happening in the production of a medical device. Look for alerts and advisories as they are provided by agencies such as FDA, FBI, CISA, or ENISA over in Europe. Join cybersecurity communities as they're provided through ISACs and ISAOs, and then also engage in international markets and make sure that, again, you're not only listening to resources from one geography, but try to cast your net as wide as possible. As for your fielded devices, look at incident and event logs. Inspect returned goods for cybersecurity indicators as well. Look at field service reports, listen to your customers. They may be reporting things to you. Implement a coordinated vulnerability disclosure process, which allows an external reporter, such as a security researcher or finder of a vulnerability, to report it back to you, either directly or via a coordinator. And the CVD process then identifies how an external entity can submit a vulnerability to you, but also then how you will process that vulnerability as part of your overall post-market management plan. And then lastly, threat intelligence. Look for changing risks. Is the threat landscape changing? Are there new international conflicts that could, for example, increase your cybersecurity risk? And you look for threat intelligence sources both in the public and private sectors. For example, many cybersecurity companies provide you with free or subscription service, threat intelligence type information. And again, collectively, all of those are referred to as cybersecurity signals that then go into your overall post-market risk management process, where you conduct your surveillance, you perform a triage, you assess risk, and then you communicate and mitigate accordingly. In some cases, you may conduct some interim action. So, for example, if you have a high risk vulnerability that is newly identified, you may want to issue an alert very quickly, even before you have a mitigation in place, but you want to make sure that your customers are informed. And while you do all of that, you want to make sure that you collect process metrics, such as, for example, vulnerability density and time to remediation and so forth. And then the output of all of that, of course, in the sense of customer transparency, is your vulnerability communication to your customers, is communication about exploitability of a given vulnerability, the use and recommendation for compensating controls, or for final remediations through updates and patches. You may, in some cases, have to communicate with regulators depending on the level of risk and harm potential. Certainly, if there was death or injury, that will require regulatory notification. You may have to engage in corrective action and recalls. You may have to deal with product shortages. And if patient data is involved, you may have to issue a breach notification in case of compromise of personal protected information. There may be even cases where the general public needs to be notified. and you may also reach out and communicate with the larger community, whether that is ISACs, ISAOs, researchers, and so forth. So yeah, that's again, once over of the overall post-market risk management process, and those are all things that should be covered in your risk management, post-market risk management plans. And then, of course, at the end of your post-market phase is the product end of life, right? You have the green phase here, which is your production and sale of a product. You stop production, you end sale of a product. You have a period of guaranteed support, which at some point extends. You may have then a period of limited support, but at some point, even that ends and the product will be out of support. What is important here is that during those stages, you continually communicate to your customers, right? End of life and end of support dates may change during the life of a product. And then once your support ends, you need to transfer not only risk, but also potentially licenses and knowledge to your customers. You typically warranty and your contracts end. And again, that is then taken over by your customers. Couple of key terms here. End of life is when you no longer produce and sell the product. End of guaranteed support, which is the point after which you no longer guarantee full support. And then the end of support is total termination. Now, the world we live in right now, obviously, may lead to certain complexities in the sense that your hardware end of life and support may be different than your cyber end of life and support. What it means is that for a given product, you may still be able to buy spare parts and get hardware-based services, but the product may run an operating system that is no longer supported. So again, bear in mind that your hardware and software / cybersecurity communication may be different. Also, the last point here is that I sometimes see people use the end of life concept in the context of the operator, user of a device, the hospital. I don't like to use that term there. It's more an end of use, right? That is different than end of life. End of use means that you stop using one infusion pump, but you're still going to continue to use the other 99. And end of use also requires data sanitization and decommissioning of a device in a formal process, which again is a operator responsibility, not a manufacturer responsibility, although the manufacturer should have designed the appropriate features into the device. So again, at some point between end of guaranteed support and end of support, the operator either takes over the responsibility for cybersecurity or ends use of device and replaces it. And that is driven by economic considerations, by practical considerations and security risk considerations. And then also, of course, risk should only be transferred if it is transferable, right? If it is not possible for the operator of a device to continue to maintain the device and provide a sufficient level of control over the device's security posture through, for example, firewalls and network architecture, then I think the concept of risk transfer becomes challenging. But again, every device is different and we need to consider each case separately. Now, contrasting the concept of overall post-market management with a specific concept of incident response. And I want to highlight what the difference is here in this somewhat simplified diagram, but I think it gets the key point across. Obviously, in a perfect world, we would have devices with no vulnerabilities, but in reality, every device has a vulnerability. And what we talked about earlier, my post-market surveillance, my monitoring of post-market signals may lead to the discovery and identification of previously unknown vulnerabilities. We talked about that a couple of slides ago. That then initiates your post-market risk assessment, which then leads to communication to your customers, potentially even regulators, as we said, and then it leads to remediation of the newly identified vulnerability, and there's a decision in between whether that vulnerability is acceptable or not exploitable. Obviously, then no remediation is required. Contrasting that with actual cybersecurity threats, right? A threat is not the discovery of a new vulnerability. A threat is an actual security event that exploits a vulnerability and triggers an incident. So a device got actually compromised and something happened. The device went down or went into an uncontrolled mode or whatever happened as part of the security incident. Now, a security incident leads to then triage and assessment, but also may indicate a previously unknown vulnerability, right? You may miss a vulnerability in all your post-market signal collection and not find out until it gets actually exploited by a new threat you weren't aware of. So that is one connection between those two processes. And then the other connection is obviously that your triage of an incident, of an actual security event, then guides the recovery, and that recovery may be supported by the remediation you developed as part of your overall post-market vulnerability management processes. So we have at the top a proactive processes where you're trying to reduce the number of exploitable vulnerabilities in fielded devices, whereas at the bottom, that is the reactive process where you deal with vulnerabilities that you may have missed and that you only uncover when they get exploited. And again, those two processes are very different, but there are some very distinct touch points between those two. So what does your typical incident response look like? You plan and prepare, like you have a process that includes defined roles and responsibilities, and you train and practice your process. Should a incident occur, it gets detected, characterized, classified, escalated if needed, and decisions are made on how to respond to it. Then there's a clinical and technical response. The hospital may make decisions around, for example, care delivery, whether they can still accept new patients, for example, or need to relocate patients and so forth, but also technical decisions such as, do I need to take the device off the network? Then I eradicate, restore the devices, restore the clinical service that is associated with the device, return to full normal state as part of my recovery, document everything, then have a post-market forensic analysis, which then leads to a lessons learned exercise and improvement of my overall incident response plan. Did I respond appropriately? Why did that incident happen? Why was I not prepared better for it? Did I have the right people involved? Did I have the right contacts I needed? And all those questions that need to be asked that then lead to improvement of your incident response plan. Now, the overall and the previous diagram kind of looked at it from the customer, the hospital perspective, but in reality, security incidents can happen anywhere, right? And if you follow your overall secure product lifecycle processes, you control security during development and integration. You have a formal release of a product, get regulatory approval, and do an engineering transfer into production. Then there may be, depending on the type of device, storage, transportation, distributors involved, and then in the end you have a field device, right? And specifically areas that are of special interest is your supply chain, right? And typically your engineers go through a formal process of approving supply chain components that get integrated in your product and are part of your overall testing. But also you may buy hardware components that contain firmware. You may buy a network card, you may buy a Bluetooth radio and other components that come with firmware on the hardware, so they don't get into your product through your what we used to call it in the olden days gold disk, but they get into your product through your hardware. They still should be approved by engineering, should be tested for security, but they may change if your supplier doesn't communicate that change to you. You may have to deal with a surprise. So there's one unique aspect we need to consider, and then the other one is that more and more medical device manufacturers are now offering external services, be it for the purpose of remote maintenance, be it for clinical or other services that support their customers and their devices. And we have seen already over the last few years a number of security incidents that started at a manufacturer-provided service, but had implications because that service was compromised on care delivery of via field devices and at the hospital. So again, in this day and age, we live with much more complex infrastructure. But back to my initial point, right, security incidents can happen anywhere. And we try to control them by using secure development lifecycle, risk management, continual testing. We have formal change management and approval processes before things go into production. We apply certain architectures. If we use cryptography, for example, we want to make sure that our cryptographic architecture, including key provisioning and PKI, is sufficiently secured. Our order management systems, our logistics systems need to be protected because if they get impacted, then I can't fulfill orders of devices and can't ship. And we have already seen examples of that. And then, of course, things can also happen during installation and maintenance. So those are all areas where we need to consider cybersecurity for the sake of protecting across the entire life cycle. We talked about pre-market risks, right? They are typically discovered through your SBOM processes, through testing, through code reviews and other processes, but no product is perfect, and sometimes pre-market vulnerabilities are discovered post-market. You miss them in your processes and you need to go back and again manage those post-market, as we discussed a few slides ago. Your supply chain may get compromised, but especially if you're getting firmware directly on hardware into your production environment, you need to sample, you need to scan and test, make sure you're getting still the approved version and everything is under control. If your production environment is compromised, your industrial control systems, your operational technology, your robots get compromised, then that may actually lead to compromised and adulterated products and may lead to shortages. And both the EU as well as the US have actually requirements that would mandate notification of shortages of certain critical medical products. Then, of course, field devices. Any security incident can lead to patient harm or impact on care delivery. And then any impact, an incident on external services may impact indirectly your customers again and your ability to service your customers via that external service. And especially this middle piece here is often overlooked, right? The impact of a security incident in your production environment on your product. And coincidentally, and I just slid this slide in here this morning, this just came out 2 days ago from the FDA, which is a white paper that actually talks specifically about impact of cybersecurity in the OT/manufacturing environment for medical product manufacturers. And this is distinctly different from the FDA product focused pre and post-market guidances. This really deals with the OT/manufacturing environment and how a security incident there can compromise the product being manufactured. And this concern is not limited to just software-based products, right? Even non-software products, consumables, or even pharmaceuticals can be affected, as we, for example, saw in 2017 when a large pharmaceutical manufacturer's production environment got taken down by the NotPetya virus, and that actually led to shortages of pharmaceuticals and vaccines globally until that, again, manufacturing environment was restored. And again, this just came out a few days ago, so I encourage everybody to look at this white paper, as well as also the other document mentioned here is from HSCC, the Health Sector Coordinating Council, which also talks specifically about medical product manufacturing and cyber incident response, which is, again, distinctly different from incident response related to fielded products at customer sites. But back to the customer-based products, right? Products operated by a healthcare delivery organization, by a hospital. We talked about this circle earlier, but we also talked about the medical device manufacturers' post-market surveillance activities, right? And one of the inputs into post-market surveillance should be information about security events and incidents at customer side, and they may be detected directly by the device and reported back, or they may be provided to you by your customers, where they pick up the phone and ask for support in a security incident. And that then kicks off the manufacturer's incident response process, which is very similar, included analysis, development of a mitigation, a final fix in form of a patch or an update, and then also, again, a follow-up analysis and a lesson learned, so that this incident response plan, as it relates to customer incidents, is improved. And of course, depending on what your analysis shows, this incident may be limited to one customer, but could affect other customers as well. And at that point, that may require disclosure across your customer base, because, again, others may be also at risk of being impacted by that incident. So at this point, we're closing fairly timely, and we're open to discussion. I see Christian has already been active in answering questions in the Q&A box. I'm not sure, Taylor, if attendees can actually unmute and ask questions verbally. Otherwise, if that is not possible, please use the Q&A box.
I'm not sure if they can unmute either, but I can read out some of the questions that we have now. So the first one is, are there any minimums for end of life, end of general support, or end of support, or is what we deem reasonable?
So that is largely driven by, I think, clinical utility factors and business factors, right? When do you end of life a product? Well, if it gets replaced by a newer, better technology or newer product. If your competitors leapfrog you and come up with a product that is better than yours, and yours doesn't sell anymore. If hardware or software components are no longer available, that may also be a trigger. So I think there's different components for end of life decision. End of support, I know of manufacturers that provide a fixed timeline. They basically say any device will be supported for 10 years after purchase. So at end of life, that will be the time of the last purchase. And many use 10 years as a target time, but have also, depending on the device type, seen longer times as well as shorter times. Devices that are lower cost may get replaced sooner, may require a shorter end of support period. Whereas if you talk about a proton beam accelerator that requires its own building to operate in, yeah, you're probably looking at a longer support period than 10 years.
And then the next question is, what is the difference between security risk management report versus cybersecurity risk management report? In the FDA cyber guidance for pre-market submission, September 2023, the FDA requires submission to include both security risk management report and cybersecurity risk management report, which is on page 12 and 45.
I don't know it off the top of my head, so I would like to go back and look at the FDA guidance and then respond by email if I could.
And then besides FDA post-market guidance 8100-5-1 and AMI TR 97, are there any other good resources that speak to the approach to assessing cybersecurity signals for determining potential impact or not, and thus triggering applicable processes for CAPA, incident response, and FA if applicable?
Yeah, I mean 81001 and TF 97 are, I think, the two leading documents. The joint security plan we had it up on screen earlier, to an extent gets into post-market management, but it's largely focused on pre-market, but it does touch on post-market. And then also, as you get this PowerPoint, other than our contact information, both for Johner as well as Medcrypt, there's a slew of resources we've added. General cybersecurity, secure by design, SBOM, threat modeling, and specific on incident response, right? There's this MITRE white paper, which, and then there are other incident response resources that we've added you can look at. Bear in mind, and the footnote here says that many incident response frameworks were written for your typical enterprise IT environment. And if you're talking about product security incident response or manufacturing OT incident response, you may have to make some modifications because they may not, let's say, apply as is, but I think there's still a good starting point.
Yeah, and not to forget things like not typically signals from IT security, but things that you should consider as proactive data collection might be, for example, OWASP top 10 threats or vulnerabilities, or competitor information, or publications, technical publications that indicate that there's a change in technology or change in perceiving threats or something like that. That is also input. So you should create a huge branch of different data sources that you write down into your post-market surveillance plan or cybersecurity management plan.
Yeah, and here also in the appendix we have a summary of notification laws and regulations, right? And of course they are very different based on the type of incident. So for example, if a patient database would get compromised and patient data gets exposed, then you have a situation that is governed by HIPAA here in the US and by GDPR in Europe. But if you have a compromise in your manufacturing environment, then you're dealing more with notification requirements related to product shortages of certain critical medical products that may require reporting, right? So again, a lot of incident notification is very situation specific.
And then, are there any significant differences you would consider between the pre-market cybersecurity risk assessment and the post-market cybersecurity assessment? Can the pre-market assessment continue to be utilized and updated once the device is released into the market?
So from a basic process and tooling perspective, there's certainly continuity. If you use one type of SBOM tool to identify your vulnerabilities, there is no need to use a different tool post-market, for example. But there are some, I think, differences in the overall concept that, for example, in pre-market vulnerability management, you're dealing with a much higher volume. You have many software components you're going to be looking at for the first time, and you uncover all the vulnerabilities that you didn't know of for the first time, and you need to address all of them. Whereas in the post-market, you typically have a lower volume, but each individual identified vulnerability will probably require a more careful analysis. Careful analysis, for example, from a patient safety perspective. So there are, I think, some differences in process, but I think from, again, general tooling perspective, you can certainly make it work. There's also a difference in who would participate, right? I think pre-market, a lot of the vulnerability decisions will be made by engineers, and only a small subset will be escalated to safety experts, clinical experts, and so forth. Whereas in the post-market, because it is something that is present in devices that are out in the field, I think by definition, you need your clinical and safety experts involved right from the beginning. That would be another difference.
And by that, the timing is also different. You have more pressure because your devices are already in the market compared to the pre-market phase.
Right. And you may have obligations for notification if there's a risk of patient harm. There may be specific timelines you need to comply with in the post-market. So yes, a good point, Christian. There are those kind of differences.
And I think that's all the time we have for questions. And then once again, I'd like to thank our speakers from Medcrypt and the Johner Institut for their presentation today, and our audience for attending this session. Thanks again, guys. I look forward to seeing you at the next webinar.
See you.
Thanks, everybody, for joining.